Good evening and welcome to tonight's In Conversation live at the Royal Society of Medicine with tonight's guest, Dr. David Halpern. My name is Professor Henrietta Bowden-Jones. I'm the President of Psychiatry and Trustee at the Royal Society of Medicine. This session is going to be highly interactive, and may I remind you to use your Q&A function, as we absolutely love your contributions. I'll move on to David's bio. He is the CEO of the Behavioural Insights Team, and since 2013, the UK's national What Works advisor. He is the author of several books and member of the government's scientific advisory group for emergencies. David, welcome, and what a pleasure it is to have you with us tonight.
No, it's wonderful to be here. By the way, I'm not on stage anymore.
I'm going to start with probably the most complicated question of the evening. I'd like to know about your sense of identity. Do you consider yourself a scientist still by now, or more of a politician?
I think definitely not a politician. I've been lucky enough to be able to work with lots of interesting figures on left and right. So I think I hope they know the difference. So if I had to choose, I think I'm a scientist, I'm a researcher. And what we actually say to our own staff, and maybe I'd apply it to myself, is, it's too bad that you have to choose between being, a researcher doing really good, methodologically strong work. In the end, I think I'm a social scientist and a methodologist, but also being a public servant, like a civil servant, or being a social entrepreneur. And what's really fun, I think, is if you can do all those three things together. And at a place like the Behavioural Insights Team, I think that's what we do. These extraordinarily talented young people who combine those elements. And I hope we're living in a world, that becomes more and more the norm. You don't have to decide, well, I'm just going to be in the university or I'm going to be in such and such. There is really interesting creative spaces which combine those approaches.
So true, and I think this is something maybe that belongs more to contemporary times. Maybe in the past it might have looked strange to have portfolio careers, but now I think there's something to aspire to. And I wonder what sorts of people you take on for the Behavioural Insights Team. What are you looking for in terms of talent? There might be people listening who might be very interested.
Well, come on board. I mean, the water's warm. So we particularly tend to value people who've got very strong methods and quantitative skills. Not only can be qualitative. The phrase behavioural insights, by the way, was coined back in 2010 in Downing Street, because we wanted to make a point that it's not just economists. In fact, Danny Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize, particularly felt this quite strongly. He's like, psychologists do. But it's not just psychologists, anthropologists. So people who've got very good methods and knowledge. We have quite a few people with neuro backgrounds, etc. Henrietta, but in the end, there are also people who are interested in a particular form of scholarship, which is applied to trying to find some solution to things in the real world. When I used to teach at Cambridge, social political sciences many years ago, I was probably amongst the most who was interested in social political sciences to do things in the world. Of course, you want to understand the world, but it's for a purpose. And then the last element tends to be quite entrepreneurial folks, because you're hitting a policy puzzle or problem, and maybe quite a wide range, which would push the comfort of many academics, but you're trying to find a solution. And that could be a government policy as a solution. It could be a kind of traditional nudge by changing a piece of choice architecture or administration, or it could be something completely different. Like actually, there's a market player who's doing something, and if they did it differently, then you'd get this positive consequence. So you can kind of have a mix of any of those, to one degree or another. But in the end, you want a kind of deep curiosity, and probably, the first thing everyone does is it's social impact. People are here because they think they can have an impact in the world.
I understand that, and I'll pick up on your nudge by reminding people. I don't know anyone who doesn't know that you wrote a bestseller book called Inside the Nudge Unit. I think it was the one of the things of that year in 2015. Oh, you brought a copy, great! It's probably the 100th edition, isn't it? But how small changes can make a big difference. So we're going to start simple. What is nudge?
The nudge is this phrase particularly linked to Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, which is the idea that you could just make a small prompt encouragement, persuasion which is relatively easy for the individual to overrule. So it's much gentler than a mandate or a, using force, which is, hence capturing the phrase. It's just a little prompt which the individual can override if they don't want to. I mean, famous examples in the world are auto enrollment in pensions. That everyone sort of means to save tomorrow, but actually if you change it from an opt-in to an opt-out, you can overrule it if you want to, but far more people save. Or everyday examples are the school canteen. What do you get to first? Do you get to the salad or the chips? And someone has to make that choice. And so a nudge is, hey, Henrietta says it'd be a really good idea to put the salad first, because it turns out that you tend to fill up your plate disproportionately with things you get to. So that's a nudge. You can walk and buy the salad, chips only for me, So it has those characteristics. Or I think a nice everyday example is a rumble strip on a motorway. Actually, that is what I think in retrospect we would call a nudge, at least. It's literally a prompt. If you were kind of slightly dozy and you weren't paying attention, you drift onto it. It makes that loud sort of noise, and it gives you a prompt, a nudge, like, oh, I'm drifting, and you get back on course. So, if you are determined to drive into the central reservation, Henrietta, you can do that, right? You can override it, but yeah, that's sort of the essence of it.
I do that often, but that's a different conversation. Okay, so I'm coming at this as a sort of behavioral addictions person, and I'm thinking about what you've just said and the difference between shaping behavior in a conscious way, where someone says to me, I really want to stop doing this. How can I do this? Or I really want to start doing this. How can I do this healthier, more emotionally nurturing behavior rather than kill myself with drugs, for example? And the way that we would shape behavior is small steps towards the ultimate goal, which, maybe abstinence, or depending on what the behavior is, but pretty much it means removing the behavior. But that implies a conscious decision on the part of the person, not just to be able to know what it is that they are wanting to stop, but also to seek help for it and to be aware of the various stages. They are on board. Whereas in your case, you seem to be implying that it's almost better if it's an unconscious response, if it's the environment that's driving your behavior. You will get to a point where it is healthier for you, better for you, but you may not be part of that decision making.
Well, several things in there. I mean, by the way, you asked about nudge, and we did everyone calls it the nudge unit, but I think we think of ourselves doing behavioral science. So we're trying to understand behaviors, and nudges is one form of lots of other levers. So we're equally interested in incentives. When do they work? When do they not? When do regulations work? When do they not? Sorry, excuse me. And a lot of these things can be very overt. They definitely don't have to be, unconscious or invisible. And a lot of them are. If you write to someone and encourage them or prompt them in some way, it's pretty overt, right? Or a street sign tells you this way. It's pretty overt. So there's a particular controversy about ones which you might be less aware of. The other thing you introduced, I think, into it, which is, of course, behaviors aren't, people aren't a blank slate. They're already doing lots of things. And a lot of behavior is, of course, as you all know well, is habit-based. What we eat, what we do, around we smoke, do you gamble, do you not? And so it's not a steady state. And so people are already in a certain kind of trench. Now, if you're a therapist, you often be going through the moves of, you try and make someone more explicit and aware and to make a choice, as you say. But, and actually, as Danny Cunningham was one of the earliest people to really point out, so much of our behavior is in fact cued by the environment as well. Or Cialdini used the phrase around click whir, when you are prompted by the following thing, you do the following. We're not quite Pavlovian, but we're not, And so sometimes you've got entrenched behavior, which the individual themselves find it very hard to get out of. Or indeed, you might decide, through government, public health, wouldn't it be good if people didn't smoke, and it's an entrenched behavior. So a lot of it is, you look at what are those forces, and indeed, it's just in fact, as you'll know, it's a world-study thing in psychology itself, the fundamental attribution error. We tend to, in ourselves, we see the field effect, but in others, we tend to think and only see the individual behavior, and we tend to miss the field effects, which drive it so strongly. So, in fact, healthy diets would be a good example, often well rehearsed around so-called obesogenic environments. You know, you might want to live healthfully and you've got good intention, but you walk down a high street and every single store is junk food.
Yeah.
You know, it's applying pressure. There's lots of forces that are influencing your behavior. So at the very least, I think it's policymakers and indeed clinicians and others have to understand these forces, because it's not a neutral environment out there.
Absolutely.
There's so many things that are nudging us all the time.
So you've now, but I'm going to save my gambling question for later about bookmakers down the high street. I want to stay with nudge for a second. So again, remember, I'm coming from a sort of psychiatric background. Are some people more nudgeable than others? Have you found that there's a sort of type of person who can't be nudged?
It's really interesting, actually. There's much less on this than you might think, research-wise. And probably, I mean, we run loads and loads of large-scale randomized controlled trials and so on, as you all know. In fact, we are rarely able to segment because the way in which the data is constructed and for it not to be intrusive. So we can often see the overall effect, and we can't dig down in more detail. I mean, is it likely, given psychological profiling and background? Yes, you'd expect some people to be more suggestible, more malleable. I mean, of course, it'll often, you know, how entrenched is your position? How much have you, I mean, classic, have you thought about this before or not? And so some things will be much more malleable by others. It's not obvious how much of that would be, if you had to explain it as an equation, how much of it is a personality factor versus other person factors, like, you know, how experienced you are in the particular issue. If you take a, you know, experienced gambler is not the same as one who is naive. In the same way, actually, smoking would be a good simple example, right? The images on packs, we know pretty well-established research, that they can make a significant difference to someone who has just started smoking, right, who the habit is not entrenched in, whereas people who have very established smoking habits seem to be able just to blank it out, right? So that would be a simple example.
Yeah. And so let me just expand this to a geographical question. So would some countries, for example, China, be as a population more likely to be nudged than, for example, a bunch of Italians? I can say that because I'm half Italian. So I'm not in any way being rude. I'm just saying, you know, there are population features, characteristics in terms of being told and being, or not told, but let's say being guided. Have you done any research internationally on this?
Well, we've done lots of work in many countries. We haven't worked, maybe we did one thing on wildlife in China, but look, there are significant national differences, which, I mean, it's an incredibly interesting area. And an important backstop to that, remember, is that so much psychological research has been done in North America, within narrow populations. And there are really interesting questions about whether there are actual deep differences in psychology. So I'm a very big fan of Joe Henrich's work, and we had a discussion with him recently, his work on WEIRD, for those who don't know it, Western educated, industrialized, rich, you know, and there's really quite compelling evidence that people like you and I, and probably most people on the call, we're probably mostly weirds. And we have certain ways of thinking and viewing the world, which turns out not to be true elsewhere. In fact, the fundamental attribution error, the over-attributing to behavior to individual personal factors, turns out to be not fundamental at all. It turns out to be an aspect of weird psychology. So there's those kind of differences. There's another one, which would be, there's a few others. One in particular may be worth, particularly Italians versus Chinese, which is tight, loose societies. So work on this around, but it's as much a pattern of social influence. So in some countries, particularly so-called tight countries, people are much, much more attuned to, if you like, social influences and what other people are doing, as opposed to, so Japan would be a classic example. You know, in COVID, if you weren't wearing a mask in Japan, for sure someone would, you know, look at you funny and give you a mask. In North America, that is not going to happen. You know, it's a very loose society. There's a different set of forces. In some causal sense, behavior is more individually driven than it would be in a tight society, and that has policy consequences. So, and Italy would be an interesting one, you know, for other dimensions, and so it has implications for, you know, policy. If you're in a Nordic country which is high social capital, blah blah blah, you know, the government sort of just needs to politely say, can you do the following thing, you know, or Japan, and people may comply in a different way. Whereas in Italy, you might have to have the police out there to wave their fingers at a few people, right, in order to comply with your COVID regulations.
Yeah.
And that's reflection of tight loose.
I've got one, it sounds like a silly question, but actually, again, more psychiatrically speaking, I think it's a fascinating one, even though I'm going to ask you myself, but then everyone else has much better questions in the chat, which I'm going to pose to you before we move on to a different topic. So do you ever nudge yourself?
Oh yeah, for sure.
What is it that you kind of end up doing better in a healthier way, and how do you implement those environmental changes or whatever?
Well, do I succeed? Well, look, like most people, we touch on health and healthy behavior. It's really hard because of all the influences around us. And a very simple example, you know, in food eating behavior is, you know, is what are the techniques that you can use on yourself? I mean, a simple one is when you've got the pile of cookies or the pack of crisps, don't bring the whole pack in with you. Yeah. Into the TV. I mean, it's a kind of simple thing, but actually, hey, you know, well, exactly. And you know, if you watch Gogglebox, they're all sat there with these piles of cakes. It's like big mistake. You know, leave it in the kitchen, just bring through the one. It's kind of obvious, but you know, you can. I mean, one of the things you could do either individually or collectively is if you're trying to change your own behavior as well, is you normally build some scaffolding around it. You know, cues or have until you try and re-establish a new habit. I mean, I don't get time to exercise very formally, but I always cycle. And now it's so routine. I would never think of going on the underground. It's just now routinized. Yeah,
yeah. And really what you're saying therefore is that consciousness and goals do come into it, because similarly I do the same. You know, I plan, actually I won't eat this whole packet of this or that. You know, you put a smaller portion, you follow through. You may have forgotten why you're doing this in the first place, but ultimately you are aware that it was a decision that you've been built in your practice, let's say. So that's interesting. You can nudge yourself. That's important. Now, let me move on to several questions in the chat. Diana Cornbrot says, how do you nudge an anti-vaxxer?
Oh, interesting question. Of course, there's been some discussion and we have done some work on that. To step back a bit, I mean, we think, of course, it changes over time, but basically amongst people who haven't been vaccinated, there's sort of three relatively distinct groups. It turns out, in fact, the majority, for most of the time, in UK and other countries, were people who were intending to get vaxxed. So they weren't anti-vaxxers. They were just like, oh, I mean to get around it. They haven't got around to it. So that's friction. There's another group actually who are just completely disengaged. It's not that they're anti-vaxxers. They just can't be bothered. They don't really believe it. They don't affect them. They'll do it probably for practical reasons. So, oh, if I have to get myself a jab in order to go on holiday, I'm fine, I'll do it. And then there's another group which we tend to call the worried, rather than anti-vaxxers. And the anti-vaxxers are themselves a sort of subset of the worried. And why is that relevant? Is because I think it does feed into the strategy. This is the group for whom you really want a much, much more intense engagement. You know, want someone who is expert, a clinician or whatever, to have a conversation. What exactly is it you're concerned about? Let's talk about it. Let's work through, listen to the concerns and so on. Now, will that work for an ultra? Maybe not. But it does for a lot of people who are worried about it, which includes at the extreme, the anti-vaxxers.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, David. Because we've got several, at times I might just sort of, you know, you go and talk and answer, and at some point I might sort of contain it and move on. So in this case, we've got David Gerber saying, do you assume an ethical position in your role? For example, if the government attempts to nudge people to undertake a damaging behavior, would you agree to that?
So there are some things, this is a really interesting and tricky one. The short answer is there are some things which we have declined. Forgive me, I won't give you the whole list, but there are some things we are asked to do by a government department where we have said we don't think this is the right thing to do, including for ethical grounds. Normally, by the way, you know, we operate primarily mainly with governments, but public sector. So you have a minister, and partly it's their role to make those judgments. So we have had the corollary, but the opposite. You're like, well, we thought something was a pretty neat idea. And we think it technically would work, but when it's tested with the minister, they're like, we don't want to do that. I'll give you a real example of that. So where we thought, for people who are late paying tax, like if you're late paying your tax, which I'm sure Henrietta has never applied.
Always, every year.
Well, you know, you might get fined. And we were saying, well, what about What if we do the other? What about for people who pay tax early? Why don't we give them a little lottery, put them in a lottery? In fact, you could literally use the fines as a variation on this on speeding, where you take the fines and you use the money to put into a pot for a lottery for people who pay early. Wouldn't that be quite neat and a positive incentive? Anyway, we thought it was a really interesting, worth pursuing. But in the end, ministers thought they don't want to do it. And they didn't want to do it, if you like, for ethical reasons, because it means that who would be the winners and who would be the losers and blah, 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 blah. So that's right. And I'll just put one last quick remark. Randomized controlled trials, of which we do lots, they can give you a test of efficacy. But another reason they can do in our world is they can also give you a sense of acceptability. So when you do that thing, how do people feel about it? Like, did that feel like, oh, that was helpful, or actually that somehow felt manipulative? And we have had the odd trial which we have terminated because people, not that it didn't work, but because people thought, no, it doesn't feel right.
Like what? Give me one example before I move on to the next question. What
sure,
was
I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago,
uncomfortable
we were doing
feedback?
work on people's, for whatever reason you want to ask, but for people's credit rating, what you can do to improve your credit rating. And it was in a period where there were liquidity issues in the economy. And it turns out there are lots of things that people aren't aware of that they can do. So, for example, being on the electoral register can improve your credit rating and various other things. So we tried this thing where we prompted people to tell them about these are things you can do to improve your credit rating, and therefore you'd borrow more and the market will better. And we had quite a few people who were like, why are you doing this? Why are you telling me this? And why is government doing this, in this particular case? And we thought, it wasn't huge numbers, but there were enough. It was like, okay, it doesn't feel right to people, right? So even if there is a gain here, so let's just kill it.
Yeah, great to get that feedback. Now we've got Nuthana Praf saying, really interesting talk. How can we nudge organizations in terms of equality and diversity? For example, removing barriers to career progression for women. Now, I know you know a lot about this, David, because of this whole report that's been written. Yeah, over to you.
So you're right. We've actually done a big program in this area, particularly on gender. It was called the Gabby program. You're welcome to look it up on our website. It's in the public domain. And we run, I think, probably close to 50 different trials and experiments and variations with a pretty good hit rate. When we work with people like Iris Bonet at Harvard, who's fantastic. So it turns out there are lots of things, actually. I can't give list. Can we just throw a couple of examples? So one interesting thing we found a gender difference in a number of areas, we did more in one country, is that women take much longer after they get turned down for a job to apply for another job. Quite a specific thing. Whereas men, it's usually like, whatever, go back again. But we found that by giving people feedback who did well, even if they didn't win, didn't get the job, actually it helps everyone, but disproportionately made women more likely to apply more rapidly again. And then that helps to close the gap, because if it's very infrequently that you go for the promotion, there's lots of stuff, of course, about the gender pay gap. I won't go through it all. I'm not just give you one other thing, a wonderful result, really interesting, which doesn't only bear on gender, but in the whole labour market. So sometimes it can be an individual level intervention, but sometimes it's at a different level. So we did this trial with the world's largest job platform called Indeed, so you may know it. And we did a prompt, in this case, a prompt to firms to say, most heads of HR say the majority of their work could actually be done flexibly. Now it turns out that, particularly for some groups, not only women, but that's a very attractive prospect. But they don't put it on the advert. So we prompt the firms to say, hey, why don't you, if you think it could be done flexibly, why don't you advertise it? So that simple prompt led to 20% more firms or jobs being advertised as flexible, which in turn get 30% more applicants. And this was done on a scale of tens of millions. So you then change the labour market to open up opportunities. So there are loads of examples, and do have a look at it. It's an amazing body of work, the Gabby program we call it.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Now, I'm going to leave, there's lots more and I'll come back to those, but I'm quite interested in your early beginnings. I'd like to, if you would, just tell us what sort of child you were and what interests you had and whether you took after one of your parents in terms of your future life and interests.
Oh boy. Oh, can't you ask me? This is much more difficult. I don't know what kind of child I was. Probably quite introverted, whatever. A little bit dyslexic. I like drawing, actually. I have this picture when I was like 3 or 4 or 5, and what are you going to do when you grow up? I'm going to be an artist. And anyway, hopefully I'll get back to that one day, or maybe not. But my father actually was an architect, an architect and urban planner, and as you may know, I actually had planned to go into architecture and urban planning as a second degree after doing natural sciences, and I used to work in his practice. I was very interested in that, and the reason why actually I didn't was because it bugged me how unempirical it was. But I mean, I'm pretty geeky. I mean, I can literally remember finding a secondhand social psychology textbook, age sort of 12, 13, and just thinking, oh my God, this is so cool. All these famous classic, particularly American psychology experiments, like the Zimbardo prison cell experiment. Or,
oh yes, I remember those.
Yeah, or the Milgram experiments. Like, oh my God, this is so interesting. And so a wonderful thing for me actually was I went off to Cambridge to do natural sciences and chemistry and maths and all the rest of it. And then the tripos, as you know, probably is incredibly flexible. And I was getting bored of physics and stuff. And I switched to experimental psych, and it was like, oh my God, this is so cool. You can study something which is really interesting. So yes, goes beyond childhood.
So talk to us about the thesis you did when you were doing natural sciences. What subject was it actually on? Was there any echo of what you were going to be doing later?
Oh my God, that's a long time ago. My final thesis as a Natsky is I did a series of experiments on near exposure effects. There are experimental psychologists on the line, which is a basic finding, which is that the more you see something, the more you like it, is the general background. And why it's also interesting is you can run experiments where you can get to the point where people are not consciously aware of they've heard, for example, a tune before, but if they've heard it before, they like it more. They can't recognize it, but they still like it, so it impacts on them. And I was pretty interested in that, and I think around faces and so on. But I also wanted to test a slight variation, which was, as I mentioned, I was interested in going to architecture and urban planning. So I thought, well, I did it with faces and other things, and also with buildings. And you could do the same thing, where you could get to the point where it was a particular construction. People who the building they'd seen before, they would like it more, or whatever. And even if they couldn't recognize it. But I'd also did it with architects and non-architects. And I had this nice side result, which was about the actual patterns of the preference, which is that basically when you took first-year architects and compared them to everyone else, they had similar aesthetic preferences. After they'd done 5 years of architecture, there was no correlation between what they thought was an attractive building and any normal person.
I love that. That's so interesting. That's
it's kind of problematic if you're an architect, though, isn't it? It's like, great, the longer you're trained, you're almost by training, you're going to produce stuff that everyone else is going to hate.
But you talked about being an artist. Can I just tell our viewers, before I go on to our precedence question to you, that actually, as we were chatting some days ago, I did comment on some of your brilliant art, and I did say it looked like a sort of German expressionist painting, and I think you're very gifted, and that's just my compliment to you. We don't need to go into it, but plus there's this. That wasn't the one I was referring to. That's a pretty unbelievable painting, but obviously there's not much German expressionism there, but it's a great, and that was hanging up in some government office, if I'm not mistaken.
Actually, the reason why it's there is there's a backstory to it. So it's just a piece of fun, really. But I've done 2 rotations in number 10, as you may know. I did a long stint in the Blair administration, and then in the strategy unit, and then I went back again in the Cameron years. And it's so if it's a reference point, that particular image, it's like a distorted face in particular ways. But and I actually have a whole pile that look a bit like that. But and it was a bit of a reminder for those who follow Nietzsche or read Nietzsche. And when Zarathustra returns to the land of whatever, after being a hermit, and he's introduced to the great scholars of the age, and the great, they seem to be men mainly, but and he recoils in horror because they're like completely overdeveloped in one particular way, so that they've become unbalanced. In fact, to use a phrase, basically, anyway, whatever, a particular phrase that he uses. And so it's like we tend to think of someone, who's got a disability because like they're missing a leg. But his basic argument is you can become so overdeveloped, like that in some other way, that you no longer function well. Anyway, so I've always thought it's a good challenge in academia, speaking as a recovered academic. You can become so narrow and expert in an area is you're unable to sort of see the problem or puzzle in the round. And so we had this hanging on the wall in the strategy unit in number 10, and then later in the IT, to remind us to try and think about things in a rounded way, not to be completely over-disordered.
I think that's such a valid point, and how easy all of us get signed off in our fields of expertise. And I think the cross-pollination is so important. Now, let me move on to our president, Roger Kirby's question. Could David comment on which key behavioural changes were necessary during the COVID pandemic, and how well did the Public Institute accept and institute these changes? Could we have done better?
Well, I'm sure we could always done better, that's for sure, right, in anything. But to answer the question, the way I tend to think about it is that it's a really interesting one, particularly public health background, is that you know, first, second, and even third lines of defence, when you think about it, have very strong behavioural components. So in the very early days, where of course it was unclear on the therapeutics, of course you don't have a vaccine, you're asking people to wash their hands. You're trying to get, how do you get a 25-year-old man to wash their hands? Like, you know, what will you do? And so you're literally working on the communications, on the what kinds of interventions, the same of course early on with masks, etc. So you're asking people to do a behaviour literally differently. And indeed, as capsulated the phrase which we coined, hands, face, place, you know, to try and be just clear about that. But when you get to second phase, like you start to have big testing, and you know, will people turn up for the testing? Will they comply when you ask them? Sorry, Henrietta, you've got, you know, someone else's. You need to stay at home for however many days. You know, it's a behavioural request you're making. And then what's the most effective way of doing that or asking it? And then even when you've got vaccines, right? You, of course, as we touched on earlier, you've got, just because you got a vaccine doesn't mean people will take it. And then you have to think about, well, what's driving hesitancy or concern? And so from start to finish, almost even around, in fact, therapeutics, you've got behavioural questions. And, you know, could they be done better? I mean, look, goodness, we could talk for an hour about that.
I'm going to lead on from this to Bruce Victor's question. Good evening. To the degree that there is a range of nudgeability, both between individuals and perhaps between cultures, is there a formal assessment of nudge ability prior to the actual nudge? I mean, presumably there's an idea of a sort of scale or a questionnaire or something to know whether you're going to be successful.
It's a bit of a theme there. I mean, so we haven't done that. Would they exist in principle? Probably. I mean, look, there's a parallel literature, I mean, literally around, it's a slightly old one to make, but it's a suggestibility where you can probe and test. We touched on earlier, by the way, in a nasty way, there are lots of people who, an organization, which are behavioral predators, which are clearly doing that, right? So they will probe in some way. If you think about some aspects of fraud, they're trying to find out rapidly who is a person who, you know, they're going to pursue further, right? And they just ping lots of people and you send out phishing mails. So in effect, you're sort of, you could say that's being done. I don't think we do that, because we try and be fairly straight about it. I mean, that's the interesting, one of the interesting things about even, so we keep using the nudge phrase, but some of these kind of prompts and cues is that they actually work, generally speaking, it's wonderful work by George Lowenstein. Even when people are aware of them, they're transparent, they still work.
Yeah.
And why is that? And that's generally because I think when do they do and when they don't work is because if you're going with a grain of something which someone kind of wants to do anyway, you're making it easier, right? You're taking out the friction. Yeah. So whereas if you think of some of the examples where you're trying to get someone who they really don't want to do it, given its character, people will be able to resist it. That's the whole point about a gentle approach.
Tell me about the Prime Minister's strategy unit. Now, we want a few anecdotes, good days, bad days, memories, things you're allowed to tell us. But come on, you were there from 2001 to 2007. You had Cameron, you had Blair, you had, you know, Jeremy Harwood, who was around at the time. So what can you tell us that we wouldn't know about those days?
Yeah, well, the strategy unit, which doesn't exist anymore. I was there for the Blair years, and I left basically the same time with when Tony went. Yeah, I mean, goodness, we had lots of things. We had lots of stuff where even the model itself, I mean, it was very radical. It was rooted in Tony's desire, like, to be able to have stronger, more strategic policy, an issue which, because it's still interesting today. And so we had examples, you know, we did some amazing, incredibly detailed reviews in the early days, where we literally spent a year on something and come back with, this is a perfect system, and you bring it into the department, like, you've got to be kidding. Actually, in psychological terms, you'd say in Vygotsky, like, you've moved out of the zone of proximal development. You've gone so far beyond the current system that people are like, you've got to be kidding. I know, good days, bad days. I mean, a bad day, we touched on obesity. We did write a paper way back then in 2003, I think it was, on basically on behaviour change, as it was titled, and there was one line reference in that paper to using around financial incentives and food. There was some questions on this, and it was made reference to about would it work, etc., etc. And the report was leaked the day before. It was just what we call a discussion paper. And I remember coming into the office, and it was mad. It was like, whoa, what is happening? And it was on the front of the Times saying PM Strategy Unit proposes fat tax. And it was just total meltdown. Number 10 comments.
I can imagine.
What are you guys doing? This is mad. And there was Department of Health like on the other phone, like, you know, it would be good if you told us about it, guys, but actually we're quite interested. Can you not shut it down? And then by the time I remember the thing that crystallized this, it was kind of mad. And I walked out to get an early lunch. It was just, you know, crazy. And, you know, people were discussing what we should the response. And in the kind of Whitehall Cafe, someone had written on, you know, instead of what you've got tuna or whatever, it was like, get your sandwich the day before the fat tax. You know? And so we knew we were really in trouble.
I love that. Now, tell us a bit about Blair. Anything, any memories about working with Blair before we move on to more questions?
Well, he was a wonderful Prime Minister to work with. I mean, not everyone will love him or hate him, but he was, as a policy person, he was incredibly interested in the evidence, and we would go to Checkers on Fridays, for example, to go through issues in a lot of detail. So he was great, and of course, if you've been a Prime Minister for that long, by the time you did, 9-10 years, you really know your brief. Yeah. So he was very knowledgeable, and so you could have policy discussions at a very high level. What's funny is you immediately have kind of flashbacks of different kind of things that he would do. I remember later on he became very interested in social exclusion, and I led the work on social exclusion for him. And one of the big things in the political cycle for Prime Ministers is after the summer break is what's your first intervention? And he wanted to make the first intervention on social exclusion. And one of the things he loved to do is he would almost very skillfully needle the media. So, because so he's doing his first interview. It was actually at Checkers, and I remember I was there to brief him or whatever, and it was Mark Easton who actually has got me into trouble lots of times over the years. But that's a different question. And Mark was under real pressure because it was a big thing. First detailed interview with the PM, and it was around Iraq war and all that. So he's trying to catch him, and he started going down this route because then Tony kind of left a few breadcrumbs about the social exclusion work, and he was talking about we really want to try and identify kids at risk much younger, to try and give them support or whatever. And then Mark says, you could sort of see his eyes lighting up. I got him. And he said, it sounds a lot like Prime Minister. You are trying to identify kids at birth about who are going to go on to be criminals, and is that what you're trying to say? And Tony leant forward in the way he's like, actually, Mark, it's much worse than that. We're going to identify them pre-birth, because it was linked, of course, to what was called the Nurse Family Partnership, David Halpern, etc. And it was like a sort of brilliant, clever thing we would do. And because the next day the newspapers were all FASBOs, fetal ASBOs would be launched.
Fantastic. That's a great anecdote. I like that. That's brilliant. Now, let me move on to Tracy Elliott's question. One of the criticisms made of nudge campaigns in the context of food, such as the Change for Life campaign, is that it places emphasis on action by individuals to change their eating and exercise habits, but fails to address the big questions which government might be in a position to address. For example, social deprivation, bad practices by the food industry, and the obesogenic environment. Do you think that there is a danger that you are being used by government so that they can claim successes in the field of public health without tackling the big, politically difficult and expensive issues? I think that's actually a great question.
It is one. I think it's a relatively easy one, I hope to answer, which is, I basically agree with the sentiment of the question in the sense that there is traditionally an overemphasis on the individual and the person factors. And that's true in many narratives, which makes it quite hard to then attack the underlying causes. so we pushed quite hard from 2014 the Sugar Levy, which was considered kind of unthinkable. But again, why are we doing that? Is because it's not primarily an instrument to drive individual behaviour. It moves small numbers. It is really a tool, along with a suite of others around advertising and so on, which is to drive reformulation. So your real target is to change manufacturer and producer behaviour so there's less sugar in the product. So we are very, very strongly of that view where, if you look at the drivers, there's a famous obesity map, so many of them are in the context and the environment. And so that's really what you want to hit. And in fact, sometimes the most effective things you do is you want to leverage the individual behavior to do things which will trigger and change the environmental context. So we just had that slightly joke exchange earlier about, don't bring all the cookies with you in front of the TV. It's like, well, what's the structural equivalent of that? So it makes it easier to live healthier when you're on autopilot rather than it's effortful. And this actually goes to weird psychology. It's a big issue, not in a narrow, but in a quite a deep way, because we have such a mental model generally about within which looms large individual agency and how it's all our personal behavior, etc. And it tends to underweight these situational factors, and it creates particular kind of difficulties around the kind of political cycle and the narrative, because it's, you go around this loop on, say, on obesity, which is, if you think it's all parents' behavior, it's like, well, it's yours because you've got no self-discipline. It's not a very good kind of causal account when you look at that wider environmental force. But then if you go for the environmental factors, then it's like, well, are you now nanny state? And, what are you doing restricting the size of our burgers or whatever it would be? So,
Yeah.
look, I agree with it. And I hope that we haven't fallen into that, although I think there is definitely a political danger, if you want to call it that, which is that policy picks off those things which over dial up on you just need to cycle more often or run more often. And it's missing the big etiological drivers. So I hope we don't do that, but I recognize the danger.
David, tell us whether you've had any big mentors in your career, in either career, to be honest, whether it's been the more recent one or the more academic one.
Well, if I had to, I think an outstanding figure for me and for many people actually in public service, you mentioned him in passing, was Jeremy Hayward, Lord Hayward, as he later was, who was an outstanding principal private secretary and number 10 at one point. He was Treasury before that. He became, actually it's very relevant to the current time, he became the PermSec head of policy within number 10 for government policy, and then later became the cabinet secretary, spanning right through most of the Cameron years and so on. So he very sadly died a couple of years ago from cancer, and was genuinely just an enormous loss, I think, to Britain, whether people are aware of it or not. And for those of us who had the privilege of working with Jeremy, I mean, he was just an extraordinary, very brilliant man. He could hold his own intellectually, but he had incredible range of knowledge. And of course, he worked all hours. And he wasn't egotistical. So he just was this, extraordinary force for good in the center of British government, open to ideas from wherever they were coming from, connecting people, joining them up, calling you up if your argument was sloppy or you weren't really thinking about the bigger, good. So I think, not just for me, in fact, I'm a trustee of the Hayward Foundation now, but, an incredible, we're lucky, I think, to get to work with people like that in our lives.
That's beautifully shared, and I have heard similar words from others as well. Must have been an outstanding individual. I want to move on to Anna van der Gaard's question. She's making parallels really between the food industry being unable to self-regulate in a way and needing that tax, and saying this is very much what appears to be happening in the world of gambling, with industry creating incentives to gamble. Now, David, I'm very well aware of your team and the great work they've embarked on, and we're all very excited about seeing what comes out of that research in gambling. Do you want to say a few words about that, and any thoughts on the gambling industry as a whole, considering the gambling review is in number 10 at the moment?
Sure. So look, I mean, one of the things about people, by the way, should, what are governments doing with these behavioral techniques, as they should with anything else, right? And I'm a big believer in, as much as possible, where are the checks and balances to make sure you're using it well and wisely. it sits against a background that these techniques are used very widely. And I think of it, behavioral science in common with most forms of science as a technology which you can use for good or bad, in just the same way as you can use, biomedical kind of science to develop amazing vaccines or weapons. And, it's not all evil, but there is very, very heavy overt use of behavioral science in gambling. People's estimates, throwing people's estimates to make it more likely that you think you'll win this and therefore you'll go for it. A Vegas casino is in a certain way a genius of behavioral science. Have a big room so you always hear someone winning, on the slot machine, so it throws your estimate because you're attuned to that. Remove signs of light and cues, right down to the highly individualistic. When you see someone starting to lose, because you're giving people as many near misses as possible, but when they're really losing, someone will intervene and say, Henrietta, sorry, it should be fun. Come and have a drink. Come have a meal on us. And now, of course, in digital forms, you can overlay A/B formatting, multiple testing, in other words, etc. So, there's, as well as the issues where some people clearly fall into. So it's really important for us to think and understand what's going on, the sophistication of that, and then say, what are appropriate responses? The very least to try and put the agency and control back in the person's hands. Just the simplest example would be, one of the robust nudges, anchoring effects. And when you have to log on and say, hey, what do you want your daily limit to be? And it starts with £250,000, right? Now you might think that's just a joke, but we know anchoring effects, however ridiculous they are, they tend to skew your estimates, right? So, what would be a fair way of having someone set a limit, which they would feel comfortable with, the day after as well, So I think it's a really interesting area, a really important area. I'm not saying it's all bad and wicked, but, it certainly uses behavioral science in pretty heavy ways. And not least, you asked about personalization. It's particularly, again, now it's digital, the extent to which you can try and work out what people's pain points are, and then sort of maximize your ability to extract, money from them, long past when the fund has stopped.
Great answer, and I will be delighted to have heard you talk about that. We've got Ravi Kumar saying, I see that your unit has done many unicorn behavior insight projects. Do you have a favorite?
So to explain this phrase, for those who haven't heard it, sometimes this unicorn business, which is normally like $1 billion business, and Britain should produce more unicorns, etc. And so we tried to use that a bit to think about where are the policy equivalents. So we've done many interventions, and some of them don't work, of course, and so you kill that, that's great, let's not do that in national policy. But there are at least a small number where you just think, wow, that really knocked it out the park. Like if you calculate the impact. If I had to have a favorite, it's like your children, which is your favorite? But if I have to, I always loved some of the actually relatively early work we did, but we have since replicated in a number of other countries with people who are unemployed to help them get back to work faster. And I'll just tell you, there were lots of variations on it. The core intervention is a lot of what's called in policy world active welfare policy. If you're unemployed, you're basically required to look for work. And the way that a job centre in Britain and many other places would do this is they'd say, Henrietta, which 3 jobs did you look for last week? Would be kind of the traditional question. And you'd have to go along and say, well, I looked for a professor at Oxford and I looked at this and, to be the, president of the Royal Society, whatever. So, and so that would be your proving you're looking for work. And you can see it's sort of done because the system is working like a policeman. And we had the hypothesis built partly on the work around implementation intention, for those who know it, but where essentially say, what happens instead of asking you about what you did last week, we just say, forget that. Why don't, if the advisor says, what are you going to do next week? So instead says, what are you going to look for? What jobs are you looking for? When are you going to look? How are you going to look? You're prompting what, where, how, etc. So it gets you to think through your actions. So some people, because classic economists, will say, well, that's really stupid because you're no longer acting with a sanction. Anyway, when we ran this intervention, we found that it got people back to work significantly faster, sort of 2 to 4% points, more likely at 13 weeks, a kind of key threshold. In fact, in some variations, 5% effects. Now, that might sound a lot, but there's 2.5 million people who go through that process every year in Britain. So if you can get them on average back to work a few days, in fact, sorry, I should have said 2 to 3 days, 2 to 4 days faster. That's a very big impact, but it's also just nicer. It's much nicer to say, hey, I'm going to help you think through how you get back into work as opposed to being a policeman. And it was also nice and improved the well-being, by the way, of the job seeker advisor. So that's been replicated now in a number of countries. And if you add a number to it, it is sort of circa £1 billion pretty comfortably. So what a wonderful intervention that is, you know, to encourage, to prompt in a creative, constructive way, as opposed to get someone to ruminate and worry about what they haven't done.
Fantastic example. And let me move on to Nicola Stingerling's question. Who should we entrust with conducting all the steps of researching, designing, conducting health nudges? Do we need to look at some kind of governance for big data driven health nudges? Thanks, David. And Nicola is part of the ethics group.
Sure. I mean, just to again make one point. I mean, I know Teresa Marteau will make this point. You know, nudges are not the only thing around behavioural science. So we are equally interested in, you know, what incentives work. You know, how do you get someone to quit smoking? You know, is it effective to get a pregnant mum and actually say, hey, if you quit, we'll give you some money or something else. So as far as we're concerned, we're interested in how do you shift the behaviour. The point still applies, which is, and I think it's just not so different than we do with any other trial, right? If you know already what is positive and what's not, you should not run a trial. It would be unethical. You know, you should work out, well, what do you think your effect size would be, and etc. It is an interesting challenge. It's that when you're working with the government, you might say, unlike a university, there are checks and balances often in the form of ministers and others who say, is that okay or is that not? In the medical world, there's very well developed ethical clearance mechanisms. They're much less developed in other areas. And I think it is appropriate. I've always said it matters who nudges the nudgers. And we should take that seriously. I'd love to see more lay audiences, by the way, involved in that.
Yeah,
not just experts.
There are lots of questions, but I'm just going to, there's a quote from you that I thought was quite telling. You said, we still have so far to go. Data from PubMed suggests that around 10,000 medical trials are published every year. How many are published covering education, crime, justice, economic growth, net zero, conflict prevention, and every other public service area you can think of? Surely less than a tenth. So what needs to happen next in relation to these big questions that government is facing?
So that is a great question, and thank you for that. I feel like I'm aware of also I'm walking in the footsteps of Archie Cochrane. In some ways, it's very similar. He had a wonderful sort of note at the end of his 1972 book on, you know, efficiency and effectiveness in health. And I feel like if Archie Cochrane came back today, and like if he was a policy wonk, he'd be like, oh my God, you know, why aren't you doing this? So I feel this quite strongly, and I discuss this periodically with Patrick Balance and Ottoline and others, is that, you know, we should think about what is a kind of R&D or research which is fit for, you know, all those other areas. And it's incredibly unbalanced. You know, so there are government departments, I won't list them all, but who have literally never done a randomized controlled trial, who are spending billions of pounds. And it's like, why do we think it's not possible? And particularly, people often say an ethical argument, but remember, you know, think of the trials that were done to develop more effective treatments for leukemia. I mean, literally life and death. I mean, really quite difficult stuff. And we're saying it's not possible to work out, you know, can we test a variation to see how can we reduce the likelihood that this person coming out of prison will be offending again, or to improve the performance of this kid in a school, or also public health interventions. So I am quite ultra on that. And as you know, I serve also as National Advisor on What Works, which is basically trying to drag the rest of the world into being as empirical. The good news, if the bad news is, oh my God, we spend £1 billion a year and we don't know if any of it does any good. The good news is, imagine if we start doing it. Imagine if we start really being empirical in these wide other domains, or even exploit the existing variants, you know, what would be possible?
Yeah.
Of course it's empirically tractable.
So actually, David, you can talk about Nesta now, and I'd like to say that I would be very keen to organise something at the Royal Society of Medicine where you return, since the number of questions and the enthusiasm from the delegates is clear. But really, if you think about it therapeutically, we have nice guidelines on hundreds of things that give us a certainty that at least we're not wasting money, we're not giving people the wrong treatment, generally speaking. And so I would love to see an answer to your quote, in a way, a sort of summary of where we are at and where we could go in terms of society and a good society's good via their work. And BIT is now incorporated inside Nesta. Is that right? Do you want to tell us? I know we don't really have very long, but why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So BIT was Behavioural Insights Team was created in Downing Street in 2010. It then became a kind of partial, partly owned by Cabinet Office, and also a partnership with Nesta and an employee benefit trust. Yeah, you're right. Just before Christmas, Nesta bought out the other shareholders, so it's now wholly owned by the innovation charity Nesta. Nesta, of course, has a track record. It has an endowment. It felt like it was time to do that, not least because we do a lot of work in other countries. I mean, literally in the US, if we're doing work, it's quite complicated to be co-owned by British government, because you can be seen, you can be an agent, you can be seen as an agent of British government. So I think it was becoming problematic. So we hope, yeah, it's a great new era, bringing the two organizations together, and we'll do some good stuff in these areas, and including bringing empiricism to areas that may be less familiar with it.
Very good, very good. So this is an invitation formally, so we can't go back on it because it's in front of hundreds of people. We'll organize it when we have coffee one day. Now I've got time for a few more things. We would love to hear about your role as one of 56 contributors to the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies in response to COVID-19. Now, what did you on the committee bring as an expertise with your insights? That can probably be your last question, generally speaking, and then I'll just ask you one last tiny thing. Yeah.
Sure. So I did a stint at Patrick's request, relatively early on, in the early days of SAGE. You can get Jeremy, of course, he was on it for much, much longer. You can ask him. I think the particular angle which, Chris Whitty and others recognize, which is the point we touched on earlier, which is there were very, very strong behavioral components in COVID, and the behavior, the things which you were asking of the public. And so alongside, if you like, the modeling and what therapeutics are likely to work and what's the dynamics of the disease, is you also need to factor in the behavioral aspects. In fact, even in the models, you talk to Neil or whatever, you're making assumptions about what do you think human beings will do. So why not inject that? And as you'll know, alongside SAGE, there's also been SPI-B, as it's generally known, to try and input that. Is it good enough? I mean, I'm always going to say the stuff's not good enough. But together, I'm ultra empiricist, and I feel like quite often when you hit these questions in government, and including around COVID, the correct answer is to say, we don't know. The truth is we don't know. And then if you can, you need to try and find out. So would it be more effective to, I'll give you a real example. Is it more effective to when you're asking someone to self-isolate, to send them a series of texts, or to call them up? In that case, we ran a trial on it. We actually found it was pretty clear, call them up was more effective. But there are a million other questions like that, where we shouldn't just say, this is what we're going to do. We should say, honestly, we don't know, but we're going to try and find out.
So here's a one-line answer for me to this question. If you had Boris's job for a week, what would be the one thing you would change?
Boy, God, that would be stressful. God, if I had to choose one area, we touched on this about behaviorally. One of the ironies about behavioral economics is it's not been applied very much to economics, in my view. And that you may or may not see it, but we think there are classes of problem where markets don't work well. So we touched on it in relation to eating. Do supermarkets compete on the basis of how healthy the food is? Not really. They compete on other things like, the price, etc. And there are lots of these so-called behaviorally based market failures, which are very, very consequential and have quite cruel aspects. And they slow growth. They work to create inequalities of certain kinds. And if I had a week, I think I would, how much you can do in a week? I'd try and have a real go at that to improve, and if you like, shape markets. Churchill famously said, we shape our buildings and they shape us. That's even more true about lots of these other less obvious forces, like the ways in which markets operate. And it's like gardening or something else. we could and should be more active to shape the characters of some kinds of markets and dynamics so that they do the things that we want them to collectively, not just where they'll run to on their own account.
I think that's a fantastic way to end a really interesting evening. And I'm sorry to all the people who have asked all the questions we haven't had time for, but David's coming back for a whole day. So that's good. Now stay with us for a second while I do some housekeeping. Next week we have, on the 16th of February, Rear Admiral Andy Kite, Assistant Chief of the Defence Staff and Chief Naval Logistics Officer, and he will be joining Professor Roger Kirby, our president, in the ICL evening to talk about his career and postings. Tomorrow at 12:30, we've got Sir Jeremy Farrar, who will discuss the Wellcome's work supporting the international research effort to end the pandemic, as well as the current picture in the UK and around the world. Please, everyone, don't forget to fill in the feedback forms. You'll get those right after the session and by email. And just to remind everyone, as I do every time, these In Conversation evenings are free. We welcome donations, so do consider doing so with a QR code on the web or on the website. And also, if you like the idea of joining us at the RSM, we would really love to have new members. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and David for a most excellent evening. It's been a real pleasure hosting you. Good night, everybody.